If you're looking to buy a home in Ocean City or anywhere at this point in time, I know it is a scary thing to think about. And one of the things that I've heard routinely is that people are fearful that this is going to be a repeat of 2007, 2008, where home prices get clobbered to the tune of 20-25%. And no one wants to be stuck buying at the peak. So in today's video, I want to talk you through why that's not the right reference point when realistically what we're seeing today is fairly aligned with what was seen way back in the 1980s. But before we dive in, if you haven't already, please make sure you hit subscribe. And if you end up liking this video, hit the thumbs up button as well. Putting out a ton of content. I'm going to continue talking all about the Ocean City housing market to make sure that you are making informed and confident decisions either way going forward. So with the 1980s, I admittedly was not alive in the late 70s and early 80s when this happened. So this is not based off of personal experience, but it's based off of research and the data. So what happened between 1978 and 1982 mirrors pretty closely what we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months at this point. We had interest rates or mortgage rates skyrocketing way back in the late 70s. They peaked at 18% before they came down to 9% by the end of that 5-year period. So they more than doubled and then were cut in half. What we've seen so far, right, from the beginning of 2022, when rates, I will say, cratered at their lowest, sub 3%, we're now up to 8%. So they've more than doubled. When and if and how and why they will come back down is something we'll get into in a minute. But one of the other things that happened back in the 80s, and again, we're going to loop in the 2007, 2008 conversation as well here. Back in the 80s, there was a shortage of supply. Existing home sales dropped by about 50% from the peak to the bottom during that 5-year span. What we've seen from 2019 to now is roughly a 40% decrease in existing home sales. If we looked at how many homes sold in 2019 in Ocean City compared to what we have seen so far in 2023, we're looking at about a 40% reduction. So again, I'm not making the case that this is going to mirror exactly the 1980s, but I think we can take some lessons from there. So as we saw back then, 70s, 80s, right? Rates go up, volume goes down. And what happened to prices? That's what I really want to hammer here. So prices during the early portion of that spiked by about 17%. They flatlined after that. So once rates hit 18%, prices did not come down, but they went flat. And basically plus or minus, we'll say maybe half a percentage to maybe a full percentage decrease at some point, depending on when you measure it. But essentially they were flat or up to a max of 1% increase year over year. That's nothing to write home about, but they certainly did not crash. What I'm hearing a lot from buyers say, and this is not to convince you one way or the other, it's just to educate, is that things are going to come crumbling down, right? 5, 10, 15, 20%. That has literally only happened one time in history during 2007, 2008. Again, it was another 5-ish year period from 2005 to 2010 where we saw the whole thing unfold. And I would argue that we're in roughly year 2 or 3 of this 5-year span that I think is really catching people off guard. So in 2007, 2008, we did not have an inventory shortage like we had back in the 70s and 80s. And like we have now, we had too much inventory. So obviously, if you have existing inventory and demand falls, prices have to come down. What we're seeing now, which again echoes what we saw back in the early 80s, late 70s, was that demand did drop, but inventory did not necessarily increase. And even if it did, it's not increasing nearly enough to really matter. We are exactly at 250 homes on the market right now. We started the year with 250 homes on the market. Yes, we saw a little bit of moderation. They actually declined through the spring and into the summer and have increased since, but we've stopped increasing. At most, I referenced this in my last video. Maybe we'll hit 275 by the end of the year, but that's a seasonality thing that usually happens anyway. And what that means is when we get to the spring, if we only have 275 homes on the market, we had 250 last year. Do you think we're going to see a huge change there, even if rates stay where they are? I would argue no. There's not enough going on the inventory and supply side to really change the dynamic. Now, that I would forecast, right? No crystal ball, but I believe that's going to keep us roughly flat until something changes. What happened back in the late 70s and 80s was just confidence in what the Federal Reserve was going to be doing, right? They jacked rates all the way up to 18% and then dropped them to 9. What's next? You're going to go up to 20, you're going to go down to 2, who knows? So once that policy was straightened out and investors had confidence in what was going to be coming, everything started to improve and pick up steam again in the housing market. Starting from 83 onward, we saw our normal appreciation start to grow far above 1% per year. Back in 2007, 2008, it took a huge correction in mortgage rates to start to spur some things, activity again. But the one thing I haven't touched on right now is, again, the recession piece. That's been talked about for a year and a half, I think, at this point, that the recession is coming. We just had GDP report get released for Q3, well above what anybody expected, over 4%. Q2 was just over 2%. So the economy really hasn't shown a whole lot of weakness. I know, right, grocery prices are up. A lot of things are more expensive, houses, cars. But from a metric and a data standpoint, things haven't really been that rough. So slowing, yes. Rough, no. So with a recession potentially coming, right, or some economic trouble, that's been clear in the 70s and 80s. That was, again, present in 2007, 2008. And again, I think we have a little bit of that going on now. But what really is going to, I believe, happen over the next year or two, again, is that I think we stay roughly flat as those rates start to stabilize, normalize, and come down. Again, there is general expectations that those rates will come back down, not to the 3s and 4s. Please do not anticipate that. Do not hope and pray that that's going to happen. We all want it to, right? But I don't think that's realistic. I think we need to adjust to the fact that we're, on a good day, going to be back down in the 6s over the next 2 years in terms of mortgage rates. And we need to adjust accordingly. If that means that a second home, right, a beach home, a rental property isn't for you, that's okay, right? It's a want, not a need. But I put out a poll recently in a private Facebook group that I have, Tips for Buying an OCNJ. Link is down in the description if you're not already a member. And the majority response when I asked how people are feeling about the market was that people are just tapped out right now. They're going to wait until rates get down into the 6s to jump back in. And if that is a budget reason, if that is a financials, that's just what you need it to be. Totally understand, respect that. However, if that's because you're expecting that prices really are going to come down by then, and that's going to be what gets you back into the market, I'd be very hesitant to depend on that. So if you want to talk through your personal circumstance, right, what's keeping you from considering the move now, what's keeping you on the sidelines, happy to chat. Because again, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and depending on where you get your news from, they don't paint pretty pictures. And I'm not here to tell you that the sky is not falling. I mean, it's not, but to bring some context, right? Some data, some relevance, boots on the ground stories of what's actually happening here so that you don't potentially miss an opportunity because you were misinformed. So with that said, I hope you agree with me that we are more likely to be back in the 70s and 80s than we are in the 2006, 7, 8, 9 era, strictly because of an inventory problem. And before we go, again, the second thing that people have responded to when I do bring up that point is that, well, inventory is going to sit and eventually people are going to have to reduce their prices. I want to burst that bubble here for a second. Most people who have their home on the market in Ocean City do not need to sell their home. They are honestly much better suited to keep it as an investment property and to rent it out than to sell it at a discount. So I don't understand that argument. I can understand why it sounds like it should make sense, but the reality is completely different. Most people here do not need to sell, and most do not want to sell. It's more of a, hey, if I can get this number, sure, then it is worth it for me to part with this piece of property in a place that I love, whether it's for my family, whether it's generating income, whether it's a piece of my generational wealth plan. People aren't just going to cast it off into the wind. And yes, unemployment can be a scary thing if there is a deep recession coming in. But again, 2007 and 8, there were no qualifications. As long as you had a pulse, you could get a mortgage. That is far from the case now. The regulations are hyper strict to the point where the strength of buyers are the highest they've ever been. So don't bank on defaults. If someone is going to lose their job, yes. Could they potentially sell their second home? Yes, of course they could. If I were to have a conversation with that person, you better believe that the thing that I'm going to ask them first and foremost is, do you really need the principal that you would gain from selling the home, or would you benefit more from turning it into a rental property? And now you have consistent income while you get your feet back on the ground. And most people, because of the price they bought it for, and their mortgage payment's not that high. The rental income that they're going to generate from that is going to be the better decision. I would say 7 or 8 times out of 10. So again, I don't encourage you or anybody to bank on a massive swing in any direction over the coming months, coming years. I think we are basically where we're going to be until rates come back down and moderate. And once that happens, we're not going to see 10, 20% gains year over year again, but we will start to see things going back up. So with that said, if you have any questions, again, you can reach me any of the ways you see down in the description. If you did like this and you found it helpful, do me a favor and hit that like button. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time.